Welcome to Forgotten Estates. This is a debate that's part of the Royal Academy's architecture programme. My name is Owen Hopkins and I'm the curator of the architecture programme at the RA, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this evening's discussion. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening. As some of you may know, we had to switch from our normal venue because of the demand for tickets was so high, and I'm pretty certain that we could have sold out this venue, which is 450 seats, by the way, several times. For those who weren't able to get a ticket, we are streaming the event on Facebook Live, if the technology is holding up. So hello and welcome to everyone watching at home. So I'm going to do a little introduction now. From the beginnings and the ruins of the Second World War, Britain's post-war housing estates have long been the focus of intense and at times passionate debate. As we will hear this evening, housing estates were the most visible manifestation and embodiment, in many ways, of the post-war belief in the common good and in the progress towards a country that was healthier, more affluent, and more comfortable for all, irrespective of wealth or class. But to their critics, who began to gain prominence in the 1970s, and then with the election of Thatcher in '79, took control of housing policy, post-war housing estates were the failed experiments of left-wing social engineering, with their concrete and tower blocks were so alien to their inhabitants that they somehow served to exacerbate the problems of social deprivation they were designed to alleviate. And this characterization is remarkably persistent and still shapes how many people view council estates today, especially if they've never actually lived in one themselves. Conversely, the views and experiences of people who actually live on estates rarely appear in the media. Success and failure when it comes to the debate about post-war housing estates are, of course, relative terms. If we consider success in improving the living conditions of millions of people, then post-war housing estates were amongst the most successful public policy initiatives of the 20th century. And in the context of today's housing crisis, then that success appears even greater. And I have a few stats which I think bear this out. In 2011, the number of households renting privately in England, this is, surpassed the number of social renters. And they have decreased slowly but steadily since the early 1980s. In the English Housing Survey of 2013-14, this stat shows that, needless to say, that the highest weekly housing costs of any category were private renting, which was £176 a week. And that was actually nearly double what social renters pay. And with 58% of the 4.4 million private renters in England aged between 25 and 45, it's not hard to see why social housing is of such interest to the young. It's also important to note that social renters were far more likely to agree that their form of tenure was a good way of occupying their home, and that was 80% compared to 53% of private renters. So, renting a council house or flat is both cheaper and more liked than renting privately. And with 1.2 million people currently on the housing waiting list, and with 260,000 of those in London alone, the need for this type of housing tenure is pretty clear. But despite all of this, post-war housing estates, as we've seen in the press, have become a target for redevelopment, particularly in London, and many people have been the victims of their estates being put up for demolition. The most notorious example is the Haygate estate, Elephant and Castle. And here, and I've got a few more stats, I'm afraid, but from the 1,200 primarily socially rented homes, they're being replaced by 2,300 flats, so nearly doubling the density on that site. But of these, just 79 will be at a social rent, which is defined as 40% of market rates, with another 212 at 50% and then 300 more at shared ownership. So there's a huge decrease of social rented accommodation on that site. Another important example, and the backdrop to this evening's discussion is Robin Hood Gardens in Poplar. If you, and this is what I did when I was doing some research for this, if you Google Robin Hood Gardens, the second autocomplete suggestion after demolition is crime, which I think tells a story about how that estate is portrayed in the media and often by politicians. So at Robin Hood Gardens, as we'll hear later on, over 200 decently sized flats in a development which many regard as an architectural masterpiece will shortly be knocked down, despite the valiant efforts of many campaigners to preserve not only a place where people live, but what, for many, is a vital bulwark against the forces that are currently transforming London's urban fabric. For those, though, on the other hand, who advocate its demolition, Robin Hood Gardens is the archetypal failed estate, an emblem of the folly and hubris of its architects, a concrete monstrosity. So this evening, what we're going to try to do is get behind the reasons why housing estates have become so totemic for both the political right and left, while not forgetting that though they have become very much an ideological battleground, for many people in this country, a housing estate is simply where they live and the place they called home. And this is what we mean in the title, Forgotten Estates. So the discussion is going to look at the ideas and the ideals that created post-war housing and how and why the status of estates have changed, the role of the media in how they're portrayed and how particular characterizations are disseminated, the question of social versus financial value, the public versus the individual good, and the increasing interest in the post-war era and its architecture. And I think perhaps above all, the nostalgia that many feel for a moment that was concerned above all about the future. So the format is very simple. Each of our 4 speakers will get 5 minutes to make an opening statement before questions from me and questions and statements from the floor. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. We begin on my far right with Kate McIntosh, an architect formerly of the London boroughs of Southwark and Lambeth, East Sussex and Hampshire County Councils, and designer of Dawson's Heights in East Dulwich. Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Which way around is this thing? Oh, yeah. Well, I graduated a long time ago in 1961 from Edinburgh. And I promptly went abroad to Scandinavia. Well, I went to Poland as well, actually, for 3 years. Arriving back in this country in '64, I worked for about a year with Dennis Lasdon on the National Theatre, being quite the most junior member of the team and having really no practical experience at all. I decided I'd really better get some mud on my boots, so I was going to be totally corralled in a theoretical design world. And casting around for where there was pressure on to get things on site quickly, I realized this was the London boroughs. Now, the London boroughs, as you probably know, they were, the responsibility for London housing was moved from the LCC to the boroughs in '64. And there was this tremendous need still. And arriving back at that time, I was fortunate that the 30 golden years that Owen has mentioned of when there was cross-party consensus that governments had a responsibility to fulfill and cater for the 3 pressing human needs for shelter, decent health, and decent education. This was not controverted by any party. And so I arrived in Southwark, was immediately allocated this absolutely fantastic site, which had really unique qualities. and got my practical experience in spadefulls in a very short space of time. Now, even while I was abroad, I was aware of two landmark schemes. One was Park Hill, Sheffield, because I was still getting the UK mags. And the other was Lillington Gardens, Starburn-on-Dark on Vauxhall Bridge Road. So these were primary influences. Now, the public sector had an inherent attraction for me. My father was an engineer, and he became the head of the direct labour organisation for Scottish Special Housing, which was a unique organisation within UK. It was set up in the interwar period to deal with three problems: the appalling state of housing in Scotland, the very poor level of skills, building skills, and the need to deal with unemployment, which was even worse in the 30s in Scotland than it was in the rest of UK. The direct labour organisation of SSHA was unique in that it tendered competitively and successfully against the commercial sector and finished its jobs on time and within budget. Where am I supposed to point this? It's not working. Oh, perhaps I got it the wrong way around.
That's it.
Oh, there we are. So I joined Southwark, as I said, in 65. In 66, that landmark film, Cathy Come Home, Ken Loach, was broadcast. And I can remember strongly my line manager coming into the office, absolutely bristling with enthusiasm and sense of mission, that at last this pressing problem, this huge social need, was being brought into everybody's home. And he said, there's going to be a huge house building program coming down the line. Now, there was already one moving, of course. Now, why did I go to Southwark? Of course, you had Lambeth and you had Camden, and I knew about both of those. Southwark had a reputation for having developed what was then thought of as a cutting-edge type of housing, high-density, low-rise. So you might think it was a bit ironic that I then developed this scheme, which is not high-density, low-rise. It's a mixture of medium density, medium rise, and low-rise. The reason was the unique qualities of this site. First of all, you've got these absolutely exceptional views, certainly exceptional in suburban South London, where you can see to the docks of London, when the docks were in London. You could probably see to Hampstead Heath on a clear day, and Primrose Hill, certainly, to the north. And to the south, you can see the North Downs and certainly Crystal Palace. It's one of an arc of hills which rises at a distance of about 4 miles from the banks of the Thames in South London. You've got Streatham Hill, Gypsy Hill, Knights Hill, Tulse Hill, Herne Hill, Sydenham Hill. So that was one of the qualities I wanted to exploit to the maximum. Another was a major constraint was that the ground conditions were extremely, but extremely unstable. There was constant landslip going on. And the structural engineers that we employed, who were very competent, they recommended that even a single-story structure to remain stable in these conditions would require 30 meters of pile. Now, that was a driven pile, which means it's banged into the ground, and the district surveyor in those days, as we had, he had to go down and inspect the foundation bottoms before it was cast. Not a very attractive job. So the other jobs that were going on in Southwark at that time, before I went there was Bonamy Street and North Peckham, where, of course, that terrible murder took place. But I thought they were well-designed schemes. They weren't necessarily well executed, but they were well-designed. And then we had the second, the IB system, industrialised building. Pressure was coming from government in order to increase throughput. The idea was that industrialised building would get them churning off the conveyor belt. So then you had Haygate and Aylesbury, which were not schemes I was thankfully involved with. I say thankfully because I think they were just too big. They were too big in that it decimated whole areas of the borough, and these people were told they could come back and live on this site later, but they knew they were going to have to find or be put into alternative accommodation for an enormously long time. So, of course, those that had any get up and go, which were the ones with the skills, went off to the new towns, which were then trying to find people to go there. So you're left with the remnants, and not surprisingly, there were a few social problems to begin with. And I think it's tragic that this community is just about bedded down, and they're going through the whole process again. Except that, of course, now they're not necessarily being offered to go back to the same site. Most of them are going to be shoved off to God knows where. So influences that were around at that time, well, of course, there was Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of American Cities. There was the Family and Kinship in East London. These were very influential books that were published. And they were saying it's not enough to give people hygienic dwellings with better space standards. In doing your slum clearances, you're actually erasing a lot of very valuable social infrastructure. And so my generation of architects, we started to look at how could you give more sense of identity to the individual dwelling within the totality. And hence this heavily modelled type of profile that many of us were aiming for. Now, the development is in the form of two-step ziggurats, as you saw from the first slide. And the fact that they're not, they are sort of flipped in relation to one another, and they also enclose a central space, was to minimize the blocking of sun and view, so that two-thirds of the dwellings get a distant view in two directions, and everybody gets a distant view in at least one direction. And the staggering of the high points means that the shadows cast are across the widest part of the enclosure. As originally designed, they step down to relate to the scale of the surrounding properties. That's one of the objectives. And of course, it's clad in London stock yellow brick. Originally, the high points where the vertical circulation takes place, there was a bridge that linked across to the lowest part, the idea being that I'll go back to the previous slide, then you can see that. Even if you were living in a lower part, if you had some heavy load or a kid in a pushchair or whatever, you wanted to use the lift, you could use the closest approximate lift. Now, of course, Thatcher comes to power and her housing advisor is Alice Coleman. And Alice Coleman, whose thinking is not particularly original at all, she's taking off from Oscar Newman, Defensible Space, was putting forward the idea that the ideal form of housing, of course, was suburban, detached, and if you couldn't actually afford detached, then semi-detached at maximum. Not even terraced housing met with her approval. So connectivity and permeability, which were objectives that we, in my generation, pursued, were totally condemned in her eyes. And hence, when the scheme was made over to Southern Housing Group, they took the bridges out, which I regard as a pity because it helped to define that inner space. I'm sure there were other ways of going about it. Anyway, another of my objectives was not to pursue the standard approach to housing estates that was I knew existed in the LCC because I'd done some work there in my vacation of putting the small families in point blocks and the larger families in four-storey walk-ups. I wanted to mix the dwelling sizes up as much as possible. So this is a diagram which shows how that was achieved. The access ways occur every third floor, and so I've got a two-bedroom, a one-bedroom, and a three-bedroom dwelling, all coming off the same access way. The idea was that families of different sizes have different needs and different demands, and that hopefully you would get, by having a more natural mix of family size, people would be able to help each other out, and neighbourliness would, and sociability would build up. I think that's my last slide. Right, I'll hand over.
Thank you, Kate, very much. And next we have Mark Crinson, who is Professor of Architectural History at Birkbeck, formerly at the University of Manchester, and he's written extensively about post-war British architecture. Mark.
Thank you. Can we get the first one up? Okay. I want to start with some broad historical points and then talk about the Smithsons and the estate that you see here, Robin Hood Gardens. We tend to see the 60s in a rather cosmetic way, the swinging 60s. So let's just start by disturbing that just a bit. What was the mid-1960s event that had most influence on the economy of the Docklands in London? Was it the Blitz, or was it, in fact, containerisation? Tilbury Dock was open in 1965, you see on the right there. I would contend that containerisation was more important than the Blitz, that London had recovered, the Docklands had recovered to some extent until 1965. It was the opening of Tilbury Dock that meant that the old dock parts of the East End were cleared out. London, this part of London had joined the globalizing post-industrial age. What was the most important cultural event of 1966? Was it the World Cup, or was it this film made for BBC, Cathy Come Home, that Kate's already mentioned? And the charity Shelter, which was formed the same year as a result of this. Through the 1960s, we have a continuing crisis in housing that Ken Loach made people strongly aware of in that year. Sorry, before we get to that. Which influential political party emerged in the late 1960s? The National Front, formed in 1967, which recuperated some of the discredited aspects of the British Union of Fascists, discredited, of course, because of its connections to German Nazism, and exploited rising unemployment in the late 1960s, especially in the East End of London. In a sense, the National Front inaugurated a new phase of post-imperial racism. And why was May 1968 important? Was it because of the events in Paris, or was it because of this? The collapse of Ronan Point, barely a mile away from the site that was beginning to be redeveloped to become Robin Hood Gardens. So we come then to the Smithsons. And I think the key question that preoccupied them throughout their career relates to some of those points I've just made, those broad historical points. And that is the question, what is belonging? How do we identify ourselves with place? And that was an insistent concern for them. And it makes their architecture, I think, still relevant in contexts today which are, to some extent, quite similar when we pull away the cosmetic view of the 1960s. And of course, in thinking about the Smithsons, one must also think about Nigel Henderson, who introduced them to the East End and from whom they took many of their ideas about it. Henderson was the photographer flaneur who strolled the East End streets, botanizing upon the asphalt, and who came out of that with photos that were, in fact, largely unprinted until more recent photographic historians rediscovered him. They were used by the Smithsons, and they have this very strong aesthetic that's concerned with decay, urban inscriptions, palimpsests, the outmoded, details, surfaces, and a kind of aformalism often in their composition. Henderson was very much dealing with the trauma of his own wartime experiences as a coastal command fighter pilot, who after the war, in a sense, finds his therapy in strolling around and taking photos of these East End streets. His wife, Judith Henderson, was part of a project called Know Thy Neighbour, Know Your Neighbour, which was which meant that she settled with him in Chisholm Hill Road in order to get to know and record the everyday experiences of one of the families that were their neighbours, who became their friends and in fact later moved out with them to Suffolk. These photographs by Henderson are very important to the Smithsons. The way in which children find their meaningful places by inscribing themselves on their surroundings. They're less, in a sense, interested in the street as a structured, bylaw-type Victorian environment than the street as a kind of arena for human performance and human meaning. And the Smithsons, of course, take this up, reproduce Henderson's photos in their own presentations that they make to Siam in Aix-en-Provence in its fourth meeting, and become part of a kind of internal critique of modernism. They never would call themselves anti-modernists. They would have called themselves anti the modernist establishment of that time, embodied by Siam. Oops, oh dear, I've done the thing I probably least meant to do, aren't I? What do I do to get that back? Ah, there we go. Okay, and of course they tried this out in their unbuilt designs for Golden Lane, just north of the city. And produce these beguiling photo montages that show a variety of cosmopolitan types cavorting upon what the Smithsons called streets in the air. Wide, they're not access decks, they're meant to have ideally space for 2 prams to pass, and they're meant to be places that recuperate and elevate the life of the East End street up in the air, so that East Enders or people living in Golden Lane, which of course is not quite the East End, so that they can continue their street life, as it were, without traffic. 17 years later, these would obviously inform the designs that the Smithsons made for Robin Hood Gardens. And I think just 2 points are probably need to be made here. One is that we can't really see that plan very well, but the Smithsons did design what they called yard gardens as part of these flats. They were on the same level as the kitchens. And the other point is that the streets in the air were continuous, so they didn't just kind of begin and end in one block. They continued around the blocks, and of course they imagined these Golden Lane blocks being extended across a larger area of the city. Now, it's useful, I think, in getting a sense of what the Smithsons stood for and how they positioned themselves as avant-garde, to watch, and it's on YouTube, so it's easy to watch the film made in 1970, The Smithsons on Housing, directed by the avant-garde novelist B.S. Johnson, whose book, The Unfortunates, has just been republished. The Unfortunates, to give you a taste of it, is an unbound book that the reader can read in any sequence that he or she wants to read. And this image on the right is taken from this film that Johnson made, and it shows the Smithsons in the way they present themselves, obviously entirely differently on one level in terms of dress from the way that Patrick Abercrombie and J.H. Forshaw are presenting themselves on the left. They are the authors of the very important 1943 County of London Plan and the Greater London Plan a year or two later. Less the charcoal or pinstripe suits than the metallic top and the glittery tie. I've watched this film quite a lot, and I've watched it without the sound as well, which helps, I think, to understand Johnson more than the Smithsons. And there's quite a lot of industrial stuff going on in this film. Johnson wants to, and the Smithsons wanted to, emphasize the industrial nature of the site. Ships floating around in the Thames, the docks, cranes, traffic, and the difficulty of dealing with this site, and also the fact that this site and its area were changing rapidly. At one point in the film, Alison opens her hand and rattles some shards of china that she holds. She says she's picked them up in one of the docks nearby, and that these are, I don't think she uses the term just at this point, but she calls them somewhere in the film remembrances in place, and elsewhere she calls them the as found. The Smithsons, as most of you probably know, have this jargon that they create themselves and they repeat again and again. But the point is that she's making quite a jump from the big elements of the industrial site around to the very small and very particular, and saying that, you know, you can take as inspiration for the way you design both the big and the very small. At one point in the film, Peter Smithson speaks of, quote, Corbusian modernism and its clean sun-drenched boxes with fitted carpets inside and vandalism outside. And and this image is shown at that point, and it's obviously an image from one of Le Corbusier's urban schemes of the 1920s. But I think Smithson's point is typical of the rather mixed views, rather ambivalent views, I think is the better term, that the Smithsons had of modernism in the 1920s at this point. The idea of sun-drenched boxes was not something that I think the Smithsons wanted from their scheme. In fact, I tend to see their scheme as anti-utopian. Too often we call all welfare state estates utopian. And I think there's an awful lot going on in the way the Smithsons think of Robin Hood Gardens, which is anti-utopian. They don't want a world in which rooms in the estate, apartments, flats in the estate are cut off from their surroundings. They don't want to see these flats as places of contemplation, regardless, as it were, of society. But it also, that statement exposes one of their concerns, vandalism. Sorry, I'll come to vandalism in just a moment. I'm talking really about the kind of estates that were built in just before this moment, really in the 1950s. And of course, Corbusian modernism could be found in London in Roehampton's Alton West estate, shown here. It could be seen also to some extent in point blocks that Kate has mentioned. And of course, the most notorious point block was Cleaver Road's Ronan Point, a mile away, as I said. And this, I think the Smithsons see as belonging to that idea of the sun-drenched vision. Of course, Ronan Point collapsed partly because of a gas explosion on the 20th floor, and partly because the Danish prefabricated system was not intended to be built at this height. And this also makes the point about, in the 1960s, the official consensus that high building was the thing to do was eroded, rapidly became eroded. And in a sense, Ronan Point was the confirmation of that erosion, of that idea. You are aware from the very start of the Smithsons on housing that they are ambivalent about what they're doing. They say, society at the moment asks architects to build these new homes. This may be really stupid. We may have to rethink the whole thing. It may be that we should only be asked to repair the roofs and the odd bathroom to the old industrial houses and just leave people where they are, to smash it up in complete abandon and happiness so that nobody has to worry about it anymore. Now, these are photos that I've taken from a very interesting PhD that was written in the 1980s by John Thirse. And they're photographs of vandalism in Robin Hood Gardens estate, including, you see on the top right there, in one of the play spaces that no longer exists at all in the estate now. But what is very clear from this film is that the Smithsons were very worried about vandalism even before the estate had been finished. In fact, vandalism, I think, is one of the big concerns of this period as a whole. What did it mean to vandalize something that was said to be in collective ownership? So the Smithsons enter their task of designing this estate, seeing this area as damaged, and seeing the kind of prospect in an ambivalent way. This is not a utopia. They have a kind of disabused realism about their job. And I think that needs to be emphasized. While at the same time they cling to a kind of poetic understanding of the everyday, which they've got from Nigel Henderson. Here's Alison Smithson from the film. Right from the start, we began to identify with the site, to put down mental roots, hooking onto Rose Bay willow herb, the children overturning wrecked cars, the smell of curry on the stairs of rejected tenements. There's something both fey about that, yeah, hooking onto Rose Bay willow herb, and the children overturning wrecked cars, the kind of monstrous social, the spectre of some kind of monstrous resident who will not ever respect what architects have designed. Of course, where a lot of this comes together is in the Smithsons' views on the street, and we can talk a lot about this, about their kind of fascination with Bath as a model, 18th century Bath as a model, their sense of the car as an existential threat to society, which contrasts, of course, very strongly with their interest in Le Corbusier in the 1920s, and indeed, of course, with the futurists' glorification of car travel, the techno-utopias of those heroic modernists of the 1920s and before. And the great concern and care that the Smithsons took in designing to control sound from the traffic, especially traffic in the Blackwall Tunnel and the feeder road into the tunnel, just to the side of the estate. And also their great care with parking in the estate. Golden Lane had no parking designed for it. The Robin Hood Gardens had what the Smithsons called moats on either side of the two blocks, in which cars were parked well away, without dominating the open public, more public spaces of the park, so that more public spaces of the estate, so that those public spaces could be theoretically enjoyed by the residents more. This would be a palisade of housing, the Smithsons said, containing a keep within it, which is what they meant by the open area in the middle, with its hillocks. And they're also fascinated by Gray's Inn on the top right there. That's from the Smithsons on housing, and what they called its stress-free zone, a green square that they compared with the green area between the two blocks of Robin Hood Gardens. I think the idea of the street with framed by terraces was entirely dead to the Smithsons. The street as a form of active life had to be elevated up into the building. And it's for this reason that I've put this contrast here up. The image on the left is from the photograph facing the frontispiece to the County of London Plan, 1943, that shows a boy, a kind of chorus figure, at the front of the picture, looking back at the viewer. In a sense, he looks forward to the future. London will be repaired. Whereas the Henderson image on the right is much more about how children actually make meaning from their already existing environment. Yep, sure, I will draw it to an end. This leads to a kind of, you call a new brutalist iconography of people around, particularly children around Golden Lane Estate. These are images by Sandra Lusada, for instance. This leads, of course, this is the elevation of the street in the air, gets connected up by the Smithsons with ideas like doorstep philosophy, eddy spaces immediately outside the front door. Here is the estate today. This was just taken last week, actually. But of course, the problem of these ideas, and of course, one thing we may want to talk about is how these things have changed in time. But one of the problems, of course, is that this kind of street in the air never had the life, never seems to have had, or very rarely seems to have the life that the Smithsons intended for it. Because, of course, it was not the street, because it didn't have traffic, because it didn't have shops, because it didn't have another set of houses across the other side of the road from it. So this is not utopia, but it was never intended as such.
Thank you very much. Jessie, there is the pointer. Jessie Brennan is an artist, has worked on a project on Robin Hood Gardens and is the author of Regeneration, Conversations, Drawings, Archives and Photographs from Robin Hood Gardens. Jessie.
Thank you, Owen, and thanks everyone for coming. Owen's asked me to talk about my work at Robin Hood Gardens, so that's what I'll do. I first came to know Robin Hood Gardens well in 2014 when I was invited by the Foundling Museum to make a new artwork for Progress, which is an exhibition of 4 contemporary responses to William Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, and they were the prints from 1735. My work, A Fall of Ordinariness and Light, pictured here, takes the form of a series of 4 graphite drawings responding to Robin Hood Gardens that imagine its planned demolition. Later, between 2014 and 15, I spent time with residents of the estate to explore the experiences of a lived-in brutalism and the personal impacts of redevelopment. The outcome of this takes the form of a book, and I'd like to share with you some of the voices from Robin Hood Gardens. And I think that the different perspectives are really telling about some of the challenges around the political debates and arguments for either demolition or refurbishment. And they also reveal residents' feelings about whom the regeneration is actually for. The following extracts are from interviews developed out of the process of making doormat drawings, which it was kind of a conversation starter, so these pieces that I'll show you shortly are called conversation pieces. And so the first quote comes from Abdul Kalam, who made these photographs, contributed to the book. Abdul grew up and lived on the estate until 2012, when he opted to be decanted from his home with his family to a council flat of his own. He highlights the complex issues around who is actually advocating saving the buildings when he tells me, quote, "It's weird, you know, people take so much interest in this estate. I've been on blogs and people from around the world know about the estate, but no one who lives there knows or understands the importance of it. When I was in uni, I did something about brutalist architecture. That's how I found out about Robin Hood Gardens. Suddenly, I was in my uni, and it was like, Robin Hood Gardens, I live there, what's going on? It was a weird moment. Shit, okay, this place is quite important. There's a whole book on this movement of architecture, and it's suddenly your block where you live, which is insignificant, which you hate, you do not like, and you're being told by everyone that it's crap. And then this book is actually showing, no, it's amazing. And that's quite strange, and you think, who's right then?" End quote. When I asked Abdul how he feels about the council selling its land to developers, he continues, quote, "When boys sit down or when mates sit down, what we say is they are basically driving the poor people out. That's what they're doing in the most simple of forms. It's not racism, it's more about wealth. We don't want you here because you don't belong here anymore. If we had a deep conversation, that's what we settle on. That's exactly what's happened," end quote. And here's Wayne Allison, who was caretaker of Robin Hood Gardens until very recently, who succinctly calls for government to, quote, "give it back to those people it was built for," end quote. And James Hamilton, former tenant of Macro Walk, which is part of the Regeneration site, when asked by a former tenant if he feels that Robin Hood Gardens has failed, he replies, quote, "I agree from an outside perspective, RHG, Robin Hood Gardens, can be seen as a failure. When I would meet a bird, bring her back, she would always say, 'What ghetto is this?' But RHG never failed us, the local government did. Robin Hood will always be a success for me and the other boys, because it gave me that chance to see life outside my own culture and bubble. Living in Robin Hood gave me the tools to teach my son about life from an eyes-open point of view," end quote. And finally, Nicholas Ruddock, resident of Robin Hood Gardens since 1982, tells me, quote, "Don't forget, what the outsider sees is a harsh, brutal concrete exterior, now dirty grey, when originally the concrete had a more golden hue or tone, as when first cast. However, as occupants, we are looking out, secure in our citadel, overseeing the locality as occupants of a castle might have in the medieval period. I always hoped the council, originally the GLC, stands for Greater London Council, would get the exterior painted white, and this may have altered perspectives. attitudes of outsiders to the monolithic block, which they saw as a delinquent among other properties, end quote. So no wonder Robin Hood Gardens elicits such passionate and varied responses from residents, evoked not only by the day-to-day experiences of life on the estate, and that's played by broken lifts, recurring lack of hot water, frequent blackouts, but it's also in how others perceive and represent it, particularly the media. So slab blocks, in my opinion then, and brutalist architecture are not at all in themselves bad, but the management and maintenance offered by the local authority often was. This is not to entirely blame Tower Hamlets Council either, where Robin Hood Gardens is situated, which has endured decades of cuts from successive governments. However, in the absence of resistance of privatisation of public housing, the council endorses the demolition of Robin Hood Gardens for short-term rewards and undermines its long-term capacity to provide decent low-cost homes for low-income households. So my project traced the material surfaces of Robin Hood Gardens and the deviated histories of its spaces, and it visualises the estate's imminent destruction, the ideological attack on council homes and the actual dismantling of council housing is discussed in homes and workspaces at the level of individual lives. The book attempts to challenge the narrative told by property developers and politicians of the need and the justification for demolition and regeneration. But it's also a painful reminder of the bureaucratic processes and the decades-long neoliberal policies that have brought Robin Hood Gardens to its knees. Today, Robin Hood Gardens may not escape demolition, but there is broad and growing network of resistance to the destruction of social housing estates. Like the spirit of a dormant brutalism, perhaps, there is hope that social housing, through its advocates and activisms, has the potential to rise and detangle itself from the logic of a kind of capitalist profit and simply be a place to live. Thanks.
Jessie, thank you very much. And finally, we have Paul Watt, who is Reader in Urban Studies at Birkbeck and works on housing activism. Paul.
Okay, I'm going to start somewhat differently. I'm not really going to talk about the architecture. I'm not going to talk about the estates. In a way, the concept of a council estate is epiphenomenal to really the fundamental key aspect of what we're dealing with. The key aspect for council housing for me is that it's a part of the welfare state. In other words, then, what happens is that council housing is a housing tenure. You can access it, you pay rent to a landlord. And the point is that you, as a citizen, need housing, but you don't have enough money to buy or rent a house in a private market. You then go to the state, and the state says, okay, you're in housing need, and we will then supply this house to you. Now, this idea that in some sense the state is responsible for providing housing is actually a relatively recent idea. It's only really been around in the last century or so. And really, you only find welfare states in certain Northern European and North American societies. They're relatively unusual. Many parts of the world, you won't actually find the idea that the state should somehow take responsibility for housing its citizens is anathema. It doesn't happen. So in other words, then, what we have to do, we have to think about council housing, for me anyway, as part of the way that the welfare state emerged, the way that the welfare state developed. I just want to try and put a statistic on this, which I think gives some idea of the scale and the importance of council housing in this city. The 2011 census, it showed that in Birmingham, the population, the number of households in Birmingham was 411,000 households. Birmingham's the second biggest city in the UK. Now, this size of Birmingham is actually smaller than the total number of households renting from councils in London. In 2011, there were 440,000 households renting council homes in London. And that's about 14% of the entire population. Now, of course, that very large, substantial figure is, of course, far less than the peak, which was 30 years earlier in the 1981 census. At that point, councils in London housed 777,000 households, 31% of the entire city. In inner London, 43% of all inner Londoners lived in council housing. Tower Hamlets, 82% of all the residents of Tower Hamlets lived in council housing, so that 2/3. Now, the point about all these statistics is this, is that council housing in relationship to the development of London as a city is not some sort of marginal phenomena, and they're certainly not forgotten estates. Council housing has actually been central, it's been key to the way that this city has developed. And it's developed, again, you can clearly see this just in relationship to walking around the city. You walk around boroughs like Camden or Islington or Southwark or Lambeth or Tower Hamlets, everywhere you will see council-built estates. You'll see council housing. Now, this is very, very dissimilar to many other European, certainly North American cities. North American cities, again, even if you take very large cities with very large public housing, the so-called projects like Chicago, Chicago Housing Authority at its peak only had 35,000 units. And most of those were actually cut off and separated behind major expressways. In Paris, the social housing units, the banlieue, they're located 20, 30 miles outside of the city. They are, in that sense, spatially marginal. So it's really not the case that London's council estates are marginal. They're not forgotten. They're actually been key to the way that the city's developed over the last century. Well, then you've got to ask yourself, okay, so, what was the kind of the distribution of council housing across the city or across the country? And it's not random. There's no randomness about it. It's very, very clear that very few wealthy, you won't find much council housing or council estates in wealthy rural areas. Where you will find lots of council housing is in predominantly industrial, urban areas, the large cities. And there's a politics to this, and you can't duck this. There's no sort of, although people talk about the post-war consensus, there was never that much of a consensus when you drill down at the local level to what was going on between Labour and Tory councils. And it's very, very clear, again, if you look at London, it was in the Labour authorities. That's where you have the large concentrations of council housing. The LCC, which is absolutely unheard of, unprecedented period of 32 years of Labour hegemony from 1933 up until 1965. It built thousands and thousands of households in the inner core. And again, if you take, so as I said, if you look at Southwark, 2/3 of all Southwark households back in 1981 were council tenants. Compare that with, say, Barnet. Barnet's pretty much always been a Tory authority. Barnet, even at its peak, never got beyond 90% of its stock as council housing. So there's a politics to this. And essentially, again, you can track this through, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. One of the ways that the Labour Party developed in London, because London, of course, was a bit different than, say, the coalfields areas or heavy industrial cities like Sheffield, because London didn't rely on large industry. London was primarily working class of small workshops. So Labour had a problem in actually being able to mobilise in that sense. So what they did throughout the first part of the 20th century was that they mobilised on a ward basis precisely around municipal socialism. We will provide you council housing on the rates. We will actually provide this thing. And it was incredibly, electorally successful, and it was also politically successful, and it also was very much part and part of the way that the Labour Party grew up and developed in the 20th century. So in other words, then, what you have is a whole series of political economic configurations have brought this thing into being. This might be a heretical thing to say, being on a panel with architectural specialists. At the end of the day, architects don't build housing. States build housing. Capital builds housing. That's the key aspect, the relationship between states and capital. And what we've clearly seen over the last 30, 40 years is a switch away from the notion that the state should provide council housing on the basis of need towards the idea that essentially private capital should produce housing on the basis of profitability. That's the key shift that's gone on. In relationship to, what's kind of the micro-politics of what's happened over the last 30 years, clearly, Thatcher, as was well known, the right to buy, the creation of the property owner democracy, these are kind of like long-term conservative interests. And also in terms of the spending on council estates during that period, during the 18 years of conservatism. By 1997, it's generally estimated that across the country, there was something like £19 billion worth of repairs needed on estates. Now, what then happens is this, in 1997. Clearly, the election of Labour in that year was a key moment. Everybody was, lots of people by 1997 were aware that the NHS was struggling. There was generally a common perception the NHS was struggling. But also, council housing was incredibly struggling. I interviewed people at the time. The conditions that people were living in were appalling in Camden. Something like in Camden, 95% of council homes didn't meet decent home standards. So what happens then is that Labour comes in 1997, but they do something different than all other Labour governments. What they do is they cut council housing out of their agenda, because they basically make this kind of pact with the electorate. You guys, you like the NHS, you like state-funded education, we're going to maintain that. But you're not too keen on council housing. You might want to buy it, but it's got all these kind of supposedly dystopian attributes to it, the kind of things that my colleagues have talked about. So what we're going to do is we're not going to actually reinvest in this part of the welfare state. They did put in the Decent Homes programme, that was investment in the existing stock, but they put in place an incredibly complicated governance arrangement. They basically said to councils, they didn't allow councils to borrow on their income streams for all kinds of reasons, which you can ask me about. But essentially then, New Labour said, right, well, you can improve your stock, the condition of the stock, but we're not going to give you any money. We're going to set targets, but there's no going to be new finance. So what we're going to do is then you can actually then have a stock transfer. You can stock transfer it to a housing association, and the stock transfer then can leave it in the funds. The housing association, can leave it in the funds. Or you can have a PFI, or you can have an ALMA, an arms management organisation. But they were against direct investment by local authorities in the stock. And in their 2000 Green Paper, they actually talk about stock transferring 200,000 homes per year. So, in other words, what's happened is this, is that the political party which created this part of the welfare state cut it off at its knees. And, they didn't build anymore. Again, you can see the figures in relationship to the country generally. Everybody knows now they didn't build enough social housing. The expectation that housing associations, the so-called third arm of the housing sector, were going to actually provide social housing at the numbers that councils used to provide in the post-war period, it never happened. It was never going to happen either. It was clear. So essentially then what you've got is you're leaving it to the market. Well, the market, as we know, the market will only provide certain kinds of housing to those people who can pay. It's certainly not going to provide homes for people who are on low incomes. It's not going to happen. by the time then, and essentially again in terms of Labour then, they carried on the right to buy, so they cut the discounts, they did implement the stock transfer, and the whole Decent Homes programme was, wrapped up in all these kind of like governance complexities. Really what was necessary in 1997 to address that £19 billion deficit was a Marshall Plan. You actually needed some sort of Marshall Plan to really kind of like address the terrible conditions that council tenants were living in, rather than the kind of like the long drawn out process that Labour took in place. Now, what happened in London, I'll just talk very briefly about London, is that at some point in the late 1990s, the Labour councils, they switched their agenda. They switched from being kind of like New Urban Left to sort of saying, look, we're deprived areas, we've got all these problems. They suddenly discovered that they got an asset base. In other words, they were sitting on valuable land. And that valuable land, of course, a lot of it is council estates. So what they've been doing then over the last decade or so, and this includes Labour councils as well as Conservative councils, is they've basically been maximising their asset base. That's what they talk about. They talk about this. But the problem that they've got, and this is the problem that you talk about in relationship to Robin Hood Gardens, is they've actually got existing residents there. So somehow they have to spring them. They've got to get rid of them. And that then is the kind of like the contentious thing, which is clearly happening right across the city in relationship to the way that, many residents in many estates, and I've spoken to, many residents on different regeneration estates. Yes, there are often things wrong with the estates. Nobody's kind of like saying that there aren't problems in estates. And a lot of that, as my colleagues have said, is down to, insufficient investment, insufficient maintenance. But nevertheless, the idea that London council estates are in any way analogous to the US projects of the 1960s and 70s is laughable. It's simply not the case. And again, if you think about, there's a whole history to the way that urban policy and regeneration has evolved. And many of the ideas have come forward from the US, particularly the Hope 6 programme, which was instituted in the mid-1990s. And that's kind of migrated to the UK. Yes, so what we need to do is knock down monotenure public estates, the projects, and replace them then with multi-tenure housing estates that will then somehow raise the aspirations of the remaining public tenants. The US projects were never the equivalent of London council estates. The levels of homicide in US projects were never, ever the levels of crime that you had on London estates. It was in many ways, it was a false analogy in many kind of ways. My experience of estates, and talking to lots of residents, is estates are incredibly mundane places. They're just places where people live, get on with their lives, have squabbles with neighbours sometimes. Some people live on big estates, some people live on small estates, some people live in houses, some people live in flats. But, as I said, the key fundamental aspect is this aspect to do with the welfare state. And what we're seeing in relationship to the housing crisis is the way that as this aspect of the welfare state is being cut to bits, so it's having all of these really incredibly negative impacts on London residents. And the spikes in homelessness, now across the city, there are something like 50,000 households living in temporary accommodation. 17,000 of those have actually been displaced out of their borough. So what you have is this sort of increasing nobodism around the homeless population, with all incredibly kind of like negative impacts on people's children, their welfare, etc., etc. And, without, this is a political issue. It's no wonder that the Conservatives have passed the awful Housing and Planning Bill 2016, because they can do this. Because the party, which should have loved and created and nurtured that part of the welfare state, didn't. So it's almost like an open goal. It's an open goal for the Conservatives to put in place even worse policies.
Thank you. thank you very much. You've heard a lot from the panel, so I think it's definitely time to hear from you. So if you have any questions or statements, please put your hands up and wait for the mic. There's 2 here. We'll take those 2 together. And then anyone else who'd like to put their hand up, please do, and someone else comes to you. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask that by continually referring to Robin Hood Gardens and other estates as sink estates, does this not just perpetuate the myth that the problems that you identified, that obviously they are there, they are problems, but are these not perpetuated by a council that will willfully let the estate die to allow the land to be sold off and redeveloped?
Jessie, do you want to take that one? And then we'll go to you.
Sure. So I think I agree with what you just said. I think in the case of Robin Hood Gardens, there have been problems. I don't think we can deny that there have been issues, but as I said in my opening statement, it was, in my view, really the council kind of not being able to maintain the estate, and that over a long period of time has really detrimental effects on residents. And some people get to the point where they do want to leave. They've had enough. They've had decades of, things not working, and, caretakers have been taken off the site, or at least reduced in the case of Robin Hood Gardens. But I think it would be simplistic to simply blame the councils. We have to, I think, as Paul has really made clear, see it as a very sort of long-term, successive decision by different parties making really poor judgments. And, the welfare state has become this thing that, is kind of, it's symbolic of everything that's gone wrong in council housing, and that it doesn't really match up to the reality of a lived experience. That's how I feel.
Okay, we'll go there, and then hopefully the mic will work this time.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
I think the first speaker will be very glad to hear that Southwark Council still has a bit of a DLO, and I work for that DLO, and I work on the Aylesbury estate. And we say in the Direct Labour Organisation, I'm a surveyor, building surveyor, is that nobody should be allowed to design any housing until they've actually maintained it for at least 5 years. Part of the Decent Homes programme's problem was that it was about kitchens and bathrooms rather than about replacing the services, which were at that period about 30 years old and had a 30-year life. So in fact, across the north part of Southwark where I work, we spend an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of money repairing leaks. So all of which probably illustrates that what the last speaker said about things being terribly mundane and basic, one of the design issues is the business about longevity of the services, but also that subsequent programmes didn't actually include maintenance as and replacement of the core services as well as the decent homes. I'm a bit of a fan of the Aylesbury estate, actually. The structure itself is incredibly well designed. The tiled finishes are still there. Do you know the ones not the Bonamy, the Brandon estate, just by Camberwell Road? There's some absolutely fantastic, if anyone gets a chance to go in there, 1970s big slab blocks which are beautifully designed and beautifully finished, and still have very happy, and the services are quite easy to maintain. So that's my little speech.
Could I come in?
Yeah. Talk about maintenance and how. And did you design the housing you worked on to be maintained very easily? I mean,
Well, one factor that hasn't been mentioned is that under Thatcher, the rent from these estates was clawed back to the Treasury and put into the General Exchequer. And the local, only 20% or thereabouts was reallocated to the landlord, the local authority, which would hardly even pay for the administration of the estate, let alone routine maintenance. And if they were to sell an asset and gain a capital receipt, severe restrictions were put on the use of that money. So they were cash-strapped every which way. They were put into a sort of corset which more or less guaranteed that the public estate would decay. And they achieved that objective. And then, of course, there was a propaganda campaign of systematic denigration to persuade people that it was impossible to have a decent environment within a publicly owned estate. I take issue, actually, with Paul about we invented public housing. What about the Eastern Bloc, where you can say that they went too far? But and in France, the banlieue, they did actually learn from that, because I had a visit to Paris, Cergy-Pontoise, new town outside Paris in, would have been 1963. They'd actually passed a law that there should be no publicly financed housing of greater number aimed at a specific income group of a greater number of dwellings than 200. So they'd learned this lesson that it was a mistake to create these huge estates of deprivation, as it were, that you were asking for trouble. You can say it was a bit late in the day, but it's more than can be said for this country.
Very quick point from Mark, and then Paul is going to come in.
Sure, just that, when you put 214 families in a housing estate like Robin Hood Gardens, of course there are problems, but there were problems before. I mean, the Grosvenor buildings, which were knocked down, which were on the site, were far higher density and had far greater problems. I mean, one is not talking here about the design of these estates causing the problems, although one can identify certain moments in their history and certain parts of these estates in which more problems were felt.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, to talk about estates as if they're inherently deprived is simply historically inaccurate. If you look at Selina Todd's marvellous book, The People, one of the important points that she talks about that, it's essentially it's a history of the working class in England. One of the points she makes about this, about council estates, is precisely that they were working class estates. People on estates had jobs. So throughout the period, most of the post-war period, the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, you had high levels of blue-collar male manual employment. What then happens is that you have a massive period of deindustrialization, which disproportionately impacts people living on estates. It's an epiphenomenon. It's nothing to do with estates per se. It's to do with rather more fundamental changes in the political economy. And plus, many of the kind of problems that estates are blamed for example, drugs, antisocial behaviour, crime, you will find these issues in exactly the same level in many of the ex-coalfields areas, which don't look anything like council estates. And that's again because of the way that you have this devastating process whereby hundreds of thousands of working class jobs in a relatively short space of time are done away with. You're going to have social problems if you do that, and that's essentially what happened. The fact that it's, concentrated in estates, it's largely epiphenomenal.
We have questions at the very top, so we'll go there and then we'll go to you in the centre.
Hello, I was wondering if any of you thought that the current upswing in interest in brutalist architecture and, you know, these massive sort of housing estate structures is part of a wider trend of the aestheticisation of poverty.
Ooh. Who would like to take that one? Maybe we'll leave that for one moment, and we'll take the next question. We'll allow our panel to ponder that.
Hi, my name is Georgie. Kate, I was really interested in your point about the way that you're trying to design in sort of individuality into the houses within the totality. And I've been kind of researching cooperative housing and wondered whether there's part of the way to address that problem is through tenure. So kind of there's quite a little known phenomenon of there being about 140 housing cooperatives in London which provide social affordable housing. And I kind of think that sort of ownership structure potentially becomes a way of unlocking some of the problems which conventional social housing sort of found itself with the kind of slightly transactional way that people kind of experience their houses, often sort of transient over time. So yeah, I was wondering whether, and there's kind of like a new interest in it, and I wonder if anyone had whether that was kind of perhaps a way forward rather than going back to sort of traditional models, where there's something in that kind of cooperative movement. And there's also kind of really interesting ways of sort of housing cooperatives expressing that architecturally. So things like the kind of winter gardens and yeah.
Who wants? Kate, that was sort of directed at you. So if you have a quick response, then we'll come back to the brutalism question.
Yes, I'm a great fan of cooperative housing. I think that the Coin Street development on the South Bank is immensely successful. And another huge success, of course, is Biker in Newcastle, where, as you know, the Erskine team went to really the most extreme degree of commitment possible to engage with the local community. And the site, although it was a large site, it was developed incrementally so that they had a consultative open office which was there open during the weekend as well, so anyone could drop by and express their preferences. Whereas where I live, so-called public consultation is a total and absolute sham. To my mind, the cooperative mode, and in Scandinavia, where, as I said, I worked for close on 3 years, that third arm of provision for housing has been active and successfully active for probably a century or more. And one of the options on offer is that the purchaser or the investor, householder, has a say in what level of finish the building is brought to before it is handed over, so they can engage in some self-build as well. They'll keep the capital costs down if they've got those sorts of skills and they've got the energy and so on. Or indeed they can train themselves up. And then, of course, you get on to Walter Siegel, self-build. And I think there's a huge demand for this in this country, and what is holding it up and restraining it is there is no facility for getting hold of land, because the big landholders want to talk to the big boys. They're not interested in small groups. In London, there is 45% roughly of sites with planning consent are in the hands of owners who have little or no interest in developing. Why should they bother when all they've got to do is sit on that land holding and the price will go up. I am also in favour of land value taxation. That would cure a multitude of ills, including land banking. The fundamental resource is land.
And you see it everywhere. We'll come back to the aestheticisation question. I mean, I just wanted to reframe it slightly and perhaps talk about, I mean, you mentioned the rise of interest in brutalism, which has become fashionable, and I wanted to perhaps put to Mark and Jessie the way that the aesthetic has somehow become detached from the ideal, and whether, I mean, Mark, you've spoken and written about that previously. If you have something to add,
yeah, sure.
Jessie.
I don't have any problem with the aesthetics of poverty. If we understand aesthetics as the understanding of the world through its sensual immediacy, then how else, this is one of the ways in which one can understand poverty. The problem is more that one is observing people's lives, and one is kind of looking, as it were, into their rooms, one is looking down at them, one is perhaps not engaging with them in that process of coming to an understanding of what their lives are like. And that's a problem, of course, that's built into a lot of modernist literature, and modernist art, and modernist architecture. The problem of the relationship between the looker, the artist, the designer, and the people for whom, and hopefully with whom, those people work. So aesthetics itself is not the problem for me. I mean, there are other problems to do with the way in which brutalism is being repackaged today, so that brutalism has become a catch-all for basically any kind of treatment, or particularly concrete, in terms of its kind of roughened surfaces. But of course, what I prefer to call the new brutalism of the 1950s and early 1960s, for one thing, was not just to do with concrete, and was hardly to do with building materials. It was to do with a way of engaging, I think an ethical way of trying to understand the contemporary world, everyday life.
Jessie, do you want to add anything to that? And I realise that we've run over already, but we'll just take a few more questions, if you may. Jessie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I guess, speaking as the only artist on the panel, I think it's really important to acknowledge the relationship one has with the participants of a project, and respecting that, like Mark says, that they are lives that you're dealing with. And that's why I'm really interested in critical ethnography. And I guess my interest in particularly Robin Hood Gardens, but more broadly council housing estates, is not this kind of aestheticization of poverty, or perhaps a fetishization of the working classes, but a concern over the way that public space is becoming privatized. And that is, for me, the kind of drive behind my research, whether it's through drawing or through dialogue. I'll keep it brief, perhaps.
Okay. Do we have any other hands going up? Yes. In the middle there, yep. If you just hold on, wait for the mic. And there was another hand there.
There's one on your right.
We'll come down to you, and then we'll finish up. If you put your hand up again, I can. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. One of Labour Party's pledges is that if they're elected in the next election, they're going to commit to a programme to build 500,000 council homes in 5 years. Which is going to be the largest municipal project or largest government project housing for some time. Okay, we've heard that one of the big problems in the past was through a lack of maintenance, through shortages in funding. So if we were to take that out of the equation, what would you say that would be one thing to absolutely remember that we got absolutely right in the previous phases, and one thing that we got wrong that we should try and improve on next time?
Right. Paul, I think that's directed at you.
So I didn't quite actually hear that, sorry.
Well,
Okay.
essentially, is Jeremy Corbyn's proposal to build 500,000 new council homes realistic in terms of providing the capital to build them and then providing the funds to maintain them? That's the essence of your question.
Well, I presume you know that Jeremy walks on water, so I'm sure that he'll be able to find the the £500 million to be able to do that, billion.
I'm saying more at the architects. Kind of what have we learned from the experience of last time round through the cycle of these estates? What did we do absolutely right, and what is it that you would look to improve again if we were doing them again tomorrow?
Okay, I understood that in terms of maintenance, because the argument you're making was actually that design is a little part of it, but...
Yeah, no, if you take the maintenance out of the equation, because we've heard that time and time again people say that the problem started with lack of maintenance and lack of investment.
So we're back to design then. Okay, Kate, you as the designer.
I don't know if anyone here has seen the wonderful graph that James Meek produced in 2014, which charted the progress of housing deliveries up until that date and the rise in house prices. And it shows very clearly how when the tap was turned off, and it was finally turned off in 1995, and of course other means of producing housing didn't pick up the slack, it just sort of jogged along at about the same pace. Consequently, of course, housing prices absolutely rocketed. At its peak, the public housing, which the peak was about 1955, was producing 225,000 houses per annum. But as I'm said from my Southwark experience, of course, once you begin to concentrate on numbers at all costs, quality tends to get squeezed out. You can't suddenly turn the tap on. You've got, it's about a 3-year lag, at least, from commission to delivery. And the building industry, construction industry, which of course is a very big employer, even with more industrialized systems, has got to have time to gear up. And it's always being used by every government as a stop-start for the economy. So it could be disastrous for any government to suddenly say, you've got to start producing 225,000 houses per annum. You've got to allow a build-up. Otherwise, the quality goes out of the window.
So you can't just turn on the tap, I think is the answer. Paul?
Yeah. Just to comment on that, it's very important, I think, to break apart the idea that there was a total Butskillite consensus in the 50s and 60s. Yes, it was the case that there was the peak year of council house provision when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, but they only did it because they actually cut the standards. And that was what the Conservatives did. They cut the standards throughout the 50s. They also introduced the horrible 1957 Rent Act. So the idea that there was this sort of, they were all playing by the same rule book in the 50s and 60s is simply not the case, really.
There was a question in the centre there. If you grab the mic. Great, and then we'll come down to you, and then we will draw things to a close.
Hi. This is for Paul, really, about the welfare state. When you compare housing to education and health, it seems housing is the weakest. It was always going to be the weakest part because it wasn't total, because it didn't include everyone. So therefore, it's kind of compared to educational health, it's much easier to roll back. I'm just wondering if you had a view on kind of why that was, post-war Labour government.
You're entirely right. It's certainly the case that the public housing was the wobbly, what's called the wobbly pillar of the welfare state. essentially, you know, of all the aspects of the welfare state, it was the only aspect which was predominantly, overwhelmingly working class part of the welfare state. And that seems to have been the easiest to roll back. Yes, it seems to be that if you don't have the middle classes as part of it, it does make it easier to roll back. There was a complex series of issues in relationship to Labour Party housing policy in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s as to what to do about this. And certainly there were, some Labour politicians who were arguing for more municipalisation. And certainly, again, if you think about this city, one of the interesting ways that boroughs like Camden, like Islington, like Southwark, the way that they actually met their increasing in council public housing was because they municipalised private landlords. They bought them up. And so there was certainly a push for doing that, really. So, again, a lot of these issues, they are political issues.
And finally here.
It's a great shame that Lord Adonis isn't here with us in the audience, so I'm going to pretend I'm Lord Adonis. The London at the moment faces great pressure to create greater housing numbers. Isn't it right that we sweep away the current council housing to create new housing for everyone?
Can I answer that?
What a provocative question to finish on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give each of the panelists no more than 2 sentences to, right? Yeah. To respond to that as succinctly as possible.
Well, Lord Adonis, if you were to cease the situation in which 75% of housing completed in inner London is marketed in the Far and Middle East before it even hits the London market, and where London is notoriously worldwide recognized as the casino where dirty money can be laundered, and where these non-doms can buy into 50-storey tower blocks around Vauxhall in order to leave those properties empty, while local authorities are being obliged
Okay, no more conjunctions.
to densify. I might think you had an argument, but as it stands,
We don't need to knock down council estates to build new housing. Council estates represent embodied energy apart from anything else. To knock them down and to build new housing instead of them is an incredible waste of resources.
Thank you.
The argument's always been about building more houses, higher density, but it's about building the right kind of houses. So just building private flats for sale isn't going to do the trick. And I think more broadly, we're talking about structural change that's needed and reducing the gap between the richest and the poorest. That's me.
The data is very clear. If you look at the GLA report, Knock 'em Up, Knock 'em Down, they looked at the 50 estates that had been regenerated from 2004 to 2014, and they found that there was sort of a net doubling of market homes on the same footprint, up to over 60,000. And there was a net loss of social housing. If Adonis, or if you get your way, then what will happen is that you will have a terrible net diminution in the amount of genuinely affordable housing, genuine social rental housing. And again, the question is that you have to ask is, who's being affected by the housing crisis? Well, the people who are most affected by the housing crisis are precisely those people who are, being pushed around the city into temporary accommodation. They're not going to get housed in any new properties that, that you're going to produce for sale, So, there has to be greater social housing. And you have to keep this council housing as you've got. In many ways, it's quite a heretical point, but for me, London's council estates, they're the jewel in the city. They're the jewels in the city.
I'm glad I let you go on. Right, very good. Well, I think that is a perfect place to draw things to a close. I'm sorry that we have run over, and thank you for your patience. But thank you very much for listening.